Snow didn't fall that night it hunted. Wind lashed the iron gates of Harrow House, burying the street in white and silence as Grayson Harrow stepped from his armored car, coat unbuttoned like he couldn't be bothered by cold or consequences. Chicago knew him as a flawless logistics king. The underworld knew him as the man who decided who got in and who disappeared. He was 3 steps from the gate when he saw them. 2 7-year-old boys huddled against the stone pillar. One stood in front like a shield, jaw clenched too tight for a child. The other hugged a battered toy truck, fingers purple with cold. Behind them, a woman slumped against the wall, barely breathing, snow melting in her hair. Grayson slowed. He didn't slow for anyone. Noah, the more protective of the two, lifted his chin and spoke like he'd already learned the world doesn't care. "Mister, we haven't eaten since yesterday." For a second, Grayson's instincts screamed trap. In his world, kindness was a doorway enemies used. The city had shelters. The state had rules. He had no room for strangers. Then he touched the woman's wrist. This wasn't cold. This was time running out. He made one call short, precise. Ambulance. Now. No sirens at the gate. The iron gates began to open, spilling warm light onto the snow like a warning. The younger boy whispered, terrified, "Are we in trouble?" Grayson looked down, voice steady as a verdict. "No. You're coming in. And you're not getting separated." He lifted the woman, impossibly light, and stepped back through his own gates. He'd spent years controlling what entered his world. That night, he let in the one thing that could ruin him 2 children who had nothing left to lose. If this opening hooked you, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who loves powerful, emotional stories. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next chapter. More unforgettable stories are waiting for you. The wrought iron gate shut behind Grayson Harrow, cutting off the snow wind outside as if the cold world had just been pushed back from his boundary. But in his arms, Lila's body was still frighteningly light. Evan Sloan had appeared from nowhere, his black coat neat, his gaze clear and alert, as if he'd never left his post. No sirens, no lights, no phone calls. "Absolute silence," Grayson said, his voice low and decisive. Evan nodded, signaling the security team to open the rear service way and to shut off the exterior gate cameras for a few minutes so no flashing lights would draw attention. The ambulance arrived exactly as requested, rolling quietly into the stone-paved courtyard, with only a soft white light falling on the melting snow. Noah stood frozen at the threshold, his hand still clamped on his little brother's shoulder as if he let go, everything would disappear. Eli trembled so hard the old toy car clicked in his hand. "Is Mom gonna die?" he whispered, so small it felt like even the wind could carry it away. Noah didn't answer. He only tightened his grip, his eyes tracking every movement of the medics like a young sentry. Grayson laid Lila onto the stretcher, stepped back half a pace, but didn't take his eyes off the 2 boys. "Warm towels, warm water, dry blankets," he said to Mrs. Caldwell as she hurried down from the kitchen stairs. "And no one raises their voice in this house." Clear. His voice wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone pause for a beat. One of the medics bent to check Lila's pulse, his expression flashing serious before he covered it quickly. They worked with urgency but in silence, as if the very air in this place demanded order. Noah glanced around the wide foyer with its crystal chandelier and polished pale stone walls, the unfamiliarity tightening him even more. "Do we have to go?" he asked suddenly, not looking at anyone in particular. No one answered right away. Grayson stepped closer, stopping in front of the boys, tall but not casting a weight over them. "No one's sending you away." His voice was firm as a verdict. "You stay here until your mother wakes up." Eli looked up, his lips trembling. "But what if you change your mind?" That small question slid like a needle through the invisible armor around Grayson. "I don't change my mind about children," he replied. "Not ever." Evan stood beside him, watching with a face that was hard to read. When the stretcher was pushed toward the ambulance doors, Noah suddenly stepped forward as if to follow. A medic offered a reassuring smile, but the boy shook his head, panic in his eyes. "I want to go with my mom." Grayson looked at the attending doctor and said only one thing. "Sit in the front." No sirens, no noise. They left in the same silence they'd arrived. The ambulance doors shut, leaving a white, cold courtyard and 2 boys standing under warm yellow light. Mrs. Caldwell wrapped a scarf around Eli's shoulders and pressed a cup of warm water into Noah's hands. The small fingers were still shaking, but no longer purple with cold. Grayson turned to Evan, his gaze sharpening into its familiar chill. "Tonight, nothing gets out. Not a single image. Not a single message." Evan nodded. "I'll handle it." Inside the living room, the fireplace had been lit. The two boys sat pressed together on the sofa, their eyes never leaving the door. Time moved slowly, dragging each second across the cold stone floor. About 40 minutes later, Grayson's phone vibrated. He took the call, listened in silence, his expression unchanged but his eyes darkening. When he ended the call, Noah shot to his feet. "How is she?" "The doctor says she's suffering from severe hypothermia and serious pneumonia," Grayson answered slowly, choosing each word as if it carried weight. "If you'd gotten her there even a few minutes later, it could have been critical." The room sank into silence. Eli lowered his head, his small hand gripping the toy car as if it was the only thing keeping him from falling. Noah didn't cry. He only stared straight at Grayson with the eyes of a child who'd just understood that time can steal everything. In that moment, Grayson realized the biggest enemy tonight wasn't the blizzard outside, and it wasn't the people waiting for an opening beyond the world he controlled. The enemy was every minute that passed, and if he was late one more time, he might not get another chance to make it right. St. Andrew Hospital was lit all night, but the light here didn't feel warm the way the fireplace at Harrow House did. It was white and cold, like the way the system ran, without emotion and without slowing down for anyone. Grayson sat on a metal bench outside the emergency room. Noah and Eli pressed close on either side of him, quiet in a way that felt unnatural for 7-year-old children. Eli had stopped shaking, but he still clung to the toy car, and Noah stared at the closed door as if he looked away for even a second, his mother would vanish. The hallway door opened, and a woman in her early 40s walked up, her hair pulled back neatly, a file clutched tight against her chest. Her gaze wasn't cold, but it wasn't soft either. "I'm Marianne Holt, a child welfare worker for Cook County," she introduced herself briefly, then looked straight at Grayson. "What are you to them?" It wasn't small talk. It was a test, Grayson answered calmly. "I'm the one who brought them in tonight." Marianne didn't blink. "That isn't a legal relationship. These two children currently don't have a confirmed stable address. If the mother becomes unable to provide care, procedure requires us to consider temporary placement." "Separate us?" Noah asked suddenly, his voice dry. Marianne crouched to meet his eyes. "We always try to keep siblings together, but that depends on the practical conditions." The truth was delivered far too evenly. Grayson held her gaze for a long moment, then asked, "What does her record look like?" Marianne opened the paperwork. Her health insurance was interrupted 8 months ago. Her address changed 3 times within a year. A chronic condition diagnosis wasn't followed with regular monitoring because she couldn't afford it. When income isn't stable, the system doesn't wait. It only records. Her voice carried no judgment, only fact. Lila didn't fail because she was weak. She failed because there was no longer a place for her inside the blank boxes on a form. Grayson was silent for a second, then said, "I can pay the entire hospital bill and the cost of recovery." Marianne shook her head, very slightly. "Money doesn't change procedure. We need a stable environment, a clearly responsible guardian, a care schedule, verified safety. You might be a powerful businessman, but here, you're only a man with no legal relationship to 2 children." The air thickened. Eli gripped his brother's hand, and Noah looked at Grayson as if the answer he gave would decide their fate. "What if she wakes up?" Grayson asked. "If the mother recovers and is assessed as fit to care for them, everything returns to the original state," Marianne replied. "But until there's an official assessment, we have to account for protection measures." "Protection by tearing a family apart?" Grayson asked again, his voice not raised but sharp enough to make the corridor fall silent for another beat. Marianne met his eyes. "Protection by making sure they don't fall through another crack. You want to help them, then do it the right way." In that moment, Grayson understood this wasn't a negotiation the way he was used to. There wasn't a contract that could buy the system's trust. There was only proof and time. He stood, tall under the hospital lights. "I'll file for temporary guardianship," he said clearly. "The children stay together. I'll provide a care schedule, a nurse, a home safety record. Everything you need." Marianne watched him for a few more seconds, like she was weighing a piece on a board. "If you do that, we'll review you thoroughly. No exceptions for reputation or money." Grayson nodded. I'm not asking for an exception. I'm asking for a chance to keep them together." Noah squeezed his little brother's hand tighter, and for the first time, his eyes held a little less panic. At the end of the corridor, the doctor stepped out and announced that Lila was past the immediate danger but needed close monitoring. Time was still the deciding factor. Grayson looked at the door to her room, then turned back to Marianne. "Start the paperwork first thing tomorrow morning," he said. "Tonight, these children don't leave me." And for the first time, in Marianne Holt's eyes, there was a very small flicker of recognition. Not for power, but for resolve. At night, Harrow House was so quiet you could hear the clockwork ticking in the grand hall, a quiet that wasn't peace, but the kind that comes from a life that's grown used to having no children. After finishing the initial paperwork at the hospital, Grayson brought Noah and Eli back while Lila remained under observation. The sprawling house, with its high ceilings and polished stone floors, looked more like a gallery than a home. Noah stepped inside slowly, his eyes sweeping over the curved staircase and the paintings on the walls as if he were memorizing every exit. He didn't ask anything else. He only gripped his little brother's hand tighter when Mrs. Caldwell appeared from the kitchen, her apron still carrying the scent of warm butter. She didn't say much, only told them to sit near the kitchen fire because it was warmer than the living room. In the yellow-lit kitchen, the soft burble of soup simmering and the smell of toasted bread drifted outward, making the air feel less foreign. Eli stared into his bowl as if it might vanish if he blinked. Noah still sat with his back straight, quietly watching every movement the adults made. When Mrs. Caldwell set down 2 slices of bread and added a small extra piece onto Eli's plate, the boy ate quickly, but never in a loud rush. Grayson leaned against the counter, silent, watching the 2 children handle warmth as if it were too luxurious to trust all the way. After a few minutes, Eli glanced around, thinking no one noticed, then slipped half the remaining bread into his coat pocket. The small, clumsy motion didn't escape Grayson's notice. He saw the child's rough calculation in it, a plan for tomorrow that a 7-year-old shouldn't have to make. He didn't say anything. He didn't expose it. He didn't ask why. He only turned to Mrs. Caldwell and told her to prepare a separate food box for each child to keep in their room, enough for breakfast and a snack. And from this point on in this house, there would be no such thing as going without food. Mrs. Caldwell understood at once, nodded, and got to work as if it was the most important order of the day. Noah saw Grayson's gaze flick toward his brother's pocket, and the boy's body tightened immediately, ready to take the blame if he had to. But when no scolding came, the guardedness in him eased, if only by a fraction. Grayson stepped closer, keeping enough distance not to frighten them. "No one has to hide food here," he said, his voice low and steady. "If you're hungry, you just say so." Noah looked at him for a beat longer, as if weighing whether he could believe those words. After the meal, the boys were led to the back sitting room off the kitchen, where the fire burned low and the light was softer than in the grand hall. The house was still luxurious, still immaculate like a museum, but in that moment, the sound of a spoon touching a bowl and the warmth from the fireplace made it feel less cold. Grayson realized that keeping the children wasn't only a matter of signing a form. It meant changing the breathing rhythm of an entire space that had grown used to control and silence. His phone vibrated on the dark wood table. Marianne Holt gave a brief notice that her department would conduct an unannounced home check as soon as possible to verify the temporary placement environment. No scheduled appointment, no privilege. Grayson listened, answered that he was ready. When he ended the call, Noah was standing at the foot of the stairs, his eyes wary again like a small guard. "Is something wrong?" he asked. "They just want to make sure this place is suitable for you," Grayson replied. Noah didn't say more, but he understood one simple thing: that anywhere, even in the biggest house in this city, they could still be taken away if the adults decided so. Grayson looked at the 2 boys, then looked around the house that had always been considered his fortress. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about enemies outside. He was thinking about whether this place could be warm enough to hold 2 children who were learning, bit by bit, how to trust. Marianne Holt arrived at Harrow House late the next morning without naming a specific time, exactly as she'd said on the phone. She didn't bring hostility, but she didn't bring leniency either. In her hands was a thick file and a printed checklist, each item laid out like lines that didn't allow mistakes. Grayson met her in the main foyer, still in a neatly tailored dark suit, calm as if he were preparing for a shareholders' meeting rather than a home inspection. Noah stood a step higher on the staircase, his eyes never leaving the unfamiliar woman. while Eli hid behind the railing, only half his face showing. Marianne began with short, precise questions about the boys' bedrooms, about emergency exits, about the fire alarm system, and the security cameras. She moved room by room, opened windows to check the locks, checked whether the bathroom had a non-slip mat, asked who would be responsible for drop-off and pickup if the boys attended preschool. Mrs. Caldwell stood nearby, answering clearly about mealtimes, bedtime, and the snacks that had already been prepared. Grayson didn't interrupt. He only listened and added details when necessary. When Marianne asked about medical care, he presented scheduled appointments with a pediatrician and information that a private nurse would come every day during Lila's recovery period. No showmanship, no long explanations, only concrete proof placed in front of her. Marianne took careful notes, then paused in Grayson's study when she noticed an open folder on his desk. His logistics company name was printed clearly on the first page, and beneath it was a document stamped as verified from a prior commercial investigation. She didn't press for details, but her gaze shifted slightly, as if she were connecting unfinished dots in her mind. "You run several major shipping routes in this city," she said slowly. "That means a lot of relationships and a lot of pressure. Children need a stable environment, not a place with hidden risks." Grayson met her eyes. "All my business operations are registered and monitored legally, and in this house, nothing goes beyond the law." He didn't raise his voice, didn't grow defensive. His calm made the room fall quieter by another beat. Marianne closed her file. "I don't evaluate you by rumors. I evaluate you by evidence. If you want temporary placement, I need a list of specific caregivers, a weekly schedule, confirmation that the children won't be left alone for any period of time that isn't appropriate." That same afternoon, Grayson had Evan finalize a contract with a certified primary school teacher, update the camera system in the common areas to meet family security standards, and send the full care schedule to Marianne's office before the sun went down. He didn't argue about being questioned. He answered with actions that were clear and clean. While the adults spoke, Noah remained in the hallway, his eyes fixed on every gesture. The boy understood that his future was being decided by paperwork and questions he couldn't control. As Marianne prepared to leave, Grayson's phone vibrated. He answered, stayed silent a moment longer than usual, then nodded. Leela was fully awake and asking to see the children as soon as possible. When he told them, Noah exhaled as if he'd been holding his breath for too long, and Eli lifted his head, his eyes brighter for the first time since the night of snow. Marianne watched their reaction and said softly, "The process continues, but the mother's recovery is a good sign." Still, she emphasized that every decision remained temporary until an official assessment was completed. Grayson ended the call, looked at the two boys, and understood that from now on, every step he took wouldn't affect only his reputation or his work. It would decide whether those two children would get to stay near their mother, in a home warm enough to hold them. Lila was moved into a recovery room that afternoon, her complexion still pale, but her eyes alert and tougher than anyone expected. When Grayson stepped in at the doctor's request to discuss the two children's situation, she looked at him like a stranger standing too close to her boundary. "Where are my children?" she asked at once. No greeting, no thanks. "At Harrow House." "Safe," Grayson answered shortly. The words made her tighten her grip on the white blanket. "You think putting them in a big house is enough? I didn't ask you. I don't owe you anything." Her voice was weak, but it didn't shake. It carried both pride and the fear of a mother who'd already lost too much. Grayson didn't react to the accusation. He pulled up a chair, keeping just enough distance not to feel overpowering. "I'm not asking you to owe me," he said. "I'm asking you to listen to the doctor first." Lila gave a thin smile. "You're used to controlling everything, aren't you? Contracts, routes, people. But these are my children. I'm taking them the moment I'm discharged." In her eyes, Grayson wasn't a savior. He was a powerful man who could turn gratitude into a chain. The tension between them didn't need raised voices to feel heavy. Grayson set a stack of papers on the table beside the bed. Temporary guardianship paperwork. The care schedule. The names of the nurse and the primary school teacher. Confirmation of Marianne Holt's home check. He didn't add anything. He let the pages speak for themselves. "I'm not keeping your children because I want to control you," he went on. "I'm keeping them because the system won't wait for you to recover." Lila stared at the documents as if they were proof of a plot. "You think I don't know how to take care of my own children? I used to work in a clinic. I know every kind of medication better than anyone." Her voice cracked at the end. Not from weakness, but from exhaustion. Grayson nodded. I know. And because you also know your body isn't ready to leave this bed today. The doctor says your lungs still need monitoring. If you leave right away, the risk of relapse is high. Lila turned her face away, as if admitting that was harder than the physical pain. For a moment, she thought Grayson would soften, would say something gentler to persuade her. But he didn't. He lifted his phone, called the attending physician directly, and asked the doctor to explain her condition again in front of them both. Not a word of flattery. Not a single vague promise. Only information that was clear, cold, and exact. When the doctor left after the conversation, the room fell quiet. Lila looked at Grayson again. The suspicion in her eyes eased slightly, but trust still wasn't there. I won't let you use money to buy my peace of mind, she said slowly. I'm not buying your peace of mind, he replied. I'm building a plan so you have time to recover without fearing the boys will be separated. That's the difference. The words weren't loud, but they landed with enough weight to hold her silent for a few seconds. Lila thought of Noah with his constant watchfulness, thought of Eli and the old toy car, thought of the possibility they could be sent to 2 different places, simply because she couldn't stay standing long enough. The doctor returned once more and reminded her she needed at least a few weeks for her lungs to fully stabilize, needed monitoring and rest in a warm environment, needed to avoid stress. If there was any place suitable, it had to be somewhere with continuous care and medical support. Lila closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, like she was signing a contract with fate itself. I'll stay close to my children, she said softly. But that doesn't mean I belong to your house. Grayson stood, adjusted his cuff. I'm not asking that. When he left the room, Lila watched his back, and for the first time, she realized the man wasn't trying to take her motherhood from her. He was only building a boundary strong enough that time wouldn't steal her family one more time. The days that followed moved to a new rhythm Harrow House had never known. Mornings began with small footsteps on the stairs, instead of the familiar silence. Mrs. Caldwell set pancakes and fruit on the table at the same time each day, and Noah began to notice that the clock in this kitchen always kept faith with what adults said. When Grayson said breakfast would be at 7:30, it was 7:30. Chairs already pulled out, milk already poured. That punctuality wasn't loud, but it was enough to build something Noah hadn't had in months, the ability to predict how tomorrow would begin. Eli was different. He didn't wake in the night as often as before. Once Mrs. Caldwell placed a small, star-shaped nightlight on the table beside his bed. The soft glow made the room feel less foreign, and he could sleep deeper, the toy car set neatly on the shelf instead of clutched in his fist like he was afraid it would be taken. Grayson watched all of it from a careful distance. He didn't interfere in every detail, but he knew the meal times, the sleep schedule, the hour the nurse came to check Lila's lungs, and the hour the primary school teacher stopped by to assess the boy's level. Everything was arranged with precise timing, but it no longer felt cold the way it once had. One afternoon, when Lila could sit up and talk for longer, she told Grayson about her old job at a small clinic on the south side of the city. She'd worked the night shift, gave injections, monitored elderly patients, knew every antibiotic and every dosage. The slide began when she was the one who needed treatment. The bouts of shortness of breath forced her to take a few weeks off. Then the medical bills piled up when her insurance was interrupted. The landlord didn't wait. One notice taped to the door was enough to push her and the boys out of their apartment. Lila described it not to complain, but the way she might read a clinical report about her own life. Grayson listened without comment, but he understood what it meant when a system turned its back the moment a link grew weak. One night, after the nurse had left and the house had settled into quiet, Noah sat on the stairstep and looked down at the living room, where Grayson was reviewing a folder of documents. The boy didn't come down right away. He asked from above, "What if Mom doesn't wake up again?" The question held no tears, only a bluntness adults couldn't sidestep. Grayson looked up. For an instant, he couldn't find an answer as quickly as he could for a contract or a business crisis. He saw in Noah a fear learned too early. "Your mother is recovering," he said slowly. "The doctor says she needs time, and she's getting time." But if Noah went on, his voice smaller, if one day she isn't here anymore? The question hung in the warm air of the room. Grayson stood, moved closer to the staircase, but didn't step onto the first stair, as if he were honoring an invisible boundary. "If that day comes," he said, "you won't have to face it alone." He didn't promise what he couldn't know. He promised only his presence. Noah looked at him for a long time, then gave a slight nod, as if recording a new commitment in an invisible notebook. When the boy went back to his room, Grayson stood still for a few seconds, his hand gripping the table edge until his knuckles turned white. He reminded himself that everything was temporary, that his task was only to keep things steady until Lila was well enough to take her children home. But when he glanced up the staircase, where the star-shaped nightlight was still glowing, his eyes betrayed that reminder. He'd begun to count their tomorrows as if they might belong to him longer than a single winter. That night, after Noah went back to his room and the star-shaped nightlight cast soft halos across the ceiling, Grayson's private phone vibrated on his desk. It wasn't the corporation's official line. Only a handful of people even knew the number. The man on the other end spoke in a low, careful voice, with no polite warm-up. "Someone's asking about 2 kids at your gate." The sentence dropped like a slip of paper onto still water. Grayson's expression didn't change. "Who's asking?" The caller didn't answer directly. Instead, he mentioned a name Grayson knew well in the city's freight and legal circles. A contractor, who was also a lawyer, someone who'd stood behind more than a few major deals tied to Harrow Logistics' warehouse routes. That name had surfaced once in the file Marianne had seen in his study. "No one brings up kids without a reason," the man added. "They're using the word leverage." The call ended quickly, but its aftertaste didn't. Grayson set the phone down, his gaze shifting from quiet to calculation. He called Evan Sloan into the study and spoke just loudly enough that his voice wouldn't carry into the hallway. "Reroute the southern shipments this week. Put a hold on the 2 contracts waiting to be signed with any company connected to the name he'd just heard. Lock down every internal access point tied to the family here." Evan understood, without needing anything explained. He left to adjust schedules, send notices, and erase any trace of exchanges that could be exploited. Everything happened fast and clean. No noise, no open conflict. Upstairs, Noah had stepped out of his room for water. He moved slowly down the corridor and stopped when he caught Grayson's low voice through the study door, cracked just slightly. He heard only a few scattered words, leverage, and asking about the kids. In the mind of a 7-year-old, those words didn't mean commerce or strategy. They meant threat. Noah stood still, his heart pounding harder. If adults were talking about children like something that could be traded, then maybe his and Eli's presence was dragging trouble toward their mother. He went back to the room, eased the door shut, and stared at Eli sleeping peacefully under the starlight. The next morning, Noah said nothing at breakfast. He watched Grayson more closely than usual, as if searching for a sign that the man could change his mind at any moment. Grayson noticed the unusual silence but didn't rush to ask. He knew there were parts of his world that should never touch children's lives. When Evan reported that the routes had been adjusted and the suspicious contracts were suspended indefinitely, Grayson only nodded. He didn't strike back. He didn't make noise. He simply cut off the contact points that could turn 2 children into a story on someone else's negotiating table. That afternoon, when Noah stood alone at the foot of the stairs, Grayson came closer and spoke softly enough that only the 2 of them could hear. "You heard something last night, didn't you?" Noah hesitated, then gave the smallest nod. "They were talking about us like I'm a problem." His voice didn't accuse. It was only tired. Grayson lowered himself to Noah's eye level. "In my work, people use complicated words for simple things. Leverage doesn't mean it's your fault. It only means someone thinks they can apply pressure. And I won't allow that." Noah held his gaze for a beat longer, then asked, "So is Mom in danger because of us?" The question made the air sink around them. "No," Grayson answered, certain and steady. "Adults create their own trouble. Children are never the cause." That night, he gathered the key staff in the house and made one thing clear. This house is separate from business. No call connected to work gets answered within these walls. No one brings the outside in here. The new rule wasn't written on paper, but it carved itself into the way people moved and spoke. As the lights in the house dimmed, Grayson stood alone in the study, looking out at the garden dusted with a thin layer of snow. He understood that some people were searching for weakness, and he understood, too, that if the underworld saw 2 children as leverage, then he had to prove that in this house there was nothing that could be used for bargaining. The next few days had seemed to settle into the new rhythm Grayson had just built, when an official envelope from the Cook County Child Welfare Office was delivered to Harrow House early that afternoon. Evan set it on Grayson's desk without saying much, only one sentence. "Marianne Holt wants you to read it immediately." Inside was a notice of a petition, requesting a review of legal paternity rights regarding Noah and Eli, along with a schedule of mandatory procedures that had to move forward under the law. There was no emotion in the lines, only clear deadlines and clauses. Grayson read it once, then called Marianne. Her voice was as even as ever. I have to formally notify you and the mother. This petition requires us to reopen the case file. Lila was downstairs in the living room, able to walk slowly now with the nurse's support. When she heard Grayson call her name, she stepped into the study with wary eyes. What is it? Grayson didn't hide the letter. There's a petition requesting a paternity review. Lila's brow tightened at once. The hospital ran my record again, or child welfare reopened it on their own. The words came fast, like she was trying to find an explanation she could control. On the other end of the line, Marianne spoke. I need to be clear. This isn't a random review. The petitioner is Carter Wynn. The name hit the room like a dry impact. Lila stopped short, the last trace of color draining from her face. That can't be, she whispered. He's been gone almost a year. He doesn't know where we are. Noah and Eli were on the rug in the living room, fitting puzzle pieces together under the late afternoon light. When Noah heard the name Carter, he snapped his head up. He didn't understand the legal meaning of what the adults were saying, but he understood that name was tied to days without food and nights when his mother sat in silence by the window. He stood immediately, pulled Eli back behind him, the way he had on the first snowy night at the iron gate. Eli looked confused, but still clung to his brother. The smaller boy didn't remember everything clearly. He only remembered the tension in their mother's voice whenever that name was spoken. Lila hurried to the boys, knelt, and gathered them both into her arms. He has no rights, she said, as if she needed to convince herself. But Marianne didn't let emotion drown out fact. Whether he has rights will be determined by procedure. His name appears on the birth certificates. Under the law, we have to schedule a supervised meeting for assessment. Her voice didn't soften, even with a family that had only just managed to stand again. Noah looked at Grayson over his mother's shoulder, his eyes holding fear and a question at the same time. Do we have to leave? This time, Grayson didn't answer right away. He looked as if he were weighing a move on a board he didn't want to sit down at. Where does this procedure take place? At the County Child Welfare Center, under the supervision of a social worker and a child psychologist. Marianne replied, No one is allowed private contact. Lila tightened her arms around the boys. I don't want them to see him. Marianne met her honestly. I understand, but refusing the meeting can be interpreted as obstruction. The best course is to let it happen under control and have it documented truthfully. The room went quiet. Noah still stood in front of Eli even though his mother was holding them both, as if he no longer trusted reassurance of any kind. The loop of fear returned with a single name. Grayson stepped closer, not touching, but close enough that his voice carried clearly. The meeting will happen as the law requires, and everything will be recorded. No one will be forced to do anything outside what's permitted. Marianne confirmed the tentative timing within the next few days and said she would send the official notice in writing. When the call ended, the room still held the echo of what hadn't happened yet, but was already enough to change everyone's heartbeat. Outside the window, the snow had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and gray. For the first time since he'd stepped into this house, Noah felt that the warm walls around him might not be thick enough to keep a name from the past from finding its way back in. The meeting was scheduled at the Cook County Child Welfare Center on a cold, gray afternoon. The supervised room arranged neatly, with a small round table and a few low chairs sized for children. Noah sat close beside Lila, Eli tucked in near his brother, and Grayson stood farther back as required, holding himself at a distance, like an observer. When the door opened, Carter Wynn walked in wearing a tailored suit and a smile that was polite in just the right measure. He carried a small paper bag, and inside were 2 brand new toys, still sealed in their boxes. Carter's voice was warm and perfectly controlled. He apologized for not showing up sooner, said life had pushed him into bad choices, and he was trying to fix things. The words slid smoothly, as if practiced in front of a mirror. For the first few seconds, if you only looked at the surface, you could believe this was a father who wanted to start over. Carter crouched to the boy's eye level, set the gift bag on the table, and said he missed them every day. Noah didn't reach out to take the gifts. He stared at the man in front of him, as if he were trying to remember whether this face had ever appeared when his mother panicked and made phone calls in the night. Lila stayed silent, her hand resting on the boy's shoulders. Carter went on with lines about responsibility and second chances, about how he now had steady work and a suitable place to live. Marianne sat beside them, writing down every word. Then, in a moment that seemed harmless, Carter let it slip that he wanted to take back what belongs to me. The sentence was light, but it was enough to turn the air. It stopped being the voice of a father, asking to be near his children, and became the voice of a man demanding property. Noah drew back slightly. Eli tightened his grip on his brother's hand. Lila looked at Carter as if she'd just heard the thing she'd feared most spoken out loud. Carter corrected himself quickly, saying he only meant he wanted to secure his legal rights as a father. His lawyer, waiting outside, had prepared all the necessary documents, birth certificates, and income verification. The reveal wasn't spoken loudly, but it was unmistakable. Carter hadn't come here on emotion alone. He'd come with a complete file and a calculated strategy. He said Lila hadn't had a stable address for a long time, and the system needed to consider a safer environment for the boys. Every sentence was chosen carefully to place Lila in a fragile position without directly attacking her. Grayson stood behind them and didn't interrupt. His eyes were cold and focused, the way they were when he measured an opponent across a negotiating table. Marianne lifted her head from the file, her voice still calm but firm. Today's meeting is only to observe the initial interaction. Any conclusions will be based on evidence and independent assessment. Carter nodded politely, his smile never cracking. When the meeting ended, he rose, adjusted his cuff, and held Grayson's gaze a second longer than necessary. No threat was spoken, but the message was clear. Out in the hallway, Marianne paused before leaving and looked at Grayson with plain honesty. "You may be used to controlling everything in your world," she said, "but here, power doesn't stand above the law." The reminder wasn't an attack. It was a warning about boundaries he couldn't cross with money or influence. Grayson gave a small nod. He understood that this fight wouldn't take place in his familiar shadows, but under the fluorescent lights of conference rooms and the black printed lines on white paper. The official supervised meeting took place in the room with the one-way glass at the Child Welfare Center, where every movement was recorded and analyzed. Noah walked in first, his back straighter than usual, trying to hold himself steady like a smaller version of an adult. Eli followed, still clutching the toy car that had become his proof of safety. Carter was already seated on the opposite side of the round table, wearing a light-colored shirt and a gentle smile as if he were attending a parent meeting at school. Lila sat beside the boys, and Marianne held her observing position, pen in hand, never leaving the paperwork. Behind the glass, Grayson watched in silence. His shadow reflected faintly on the surface like a sharp-edged outline. Carter began in a soft voice, asking about school, about favorite foods, about how the boys had grown. He didn't touch them, didn't raise his voice, only leaned forward just enough to feel friendly. But inside every question was an invisible pressure, as if each answer was being weighed. Noah answered briefly, his eyes never leaving the man's face. Eli stayed quiet, rolling the toy car back and forth on the tabletop, the soft click of plastic sounding in the tense air. Carter mentioned that he had a new house now, separate rooms for the boys, a stable job, a long-term plan. His voice stayed even and confident, as if everything was ready for them to come home. Then he asked Noah if he remembered the times he'd driven him to the park. Noah hesitated. He remembered a few things, but what rose most clearly was a different night. He glanced at his mother, then looked back at Carter. "I remember one time Mom had to go to the hospital because she couldn't breathe," he said slowly. "Mom called you, but you didn't come." The room seemed to pause for a single breath. Carter froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a thin smile, saying that he'd had personal problems then and hadn't gotten the call in time. But Noah didn't stop. "Mom sat in the hallway by herself," he went on, his voice small but clear. "Me and Eli slept on the waiting room chairs until morning. You didn't come." Marianne wrote faster, her expression shifting slightly. Lila lowered her head, her hand tightening on her knee. The truth wasn't shouted, but it was more present than any promise. Carter tried to regain control by insisting the past couldn't be changed, and he was here to make things right. But Noah's words had opened a crack that couldn't be covered. Behind the glass, Grayson didn't move. He only stared through the reflection, his gaze cold and heavy like a warning that didn't need sound. No threats, no aggressive gesture, only a presence strong enough to remind everyone that he was witnessing every detail. When the meeting ended at the scheduled time, Carter stood, adjusted his jacket, and let his eyes travel to the glass. The look landed straight on Grayson, not openly hostile, but clearly a silent challenge. This game isn't over. He turned and walked out into the hallway, leaving the room weighted with the aftermath of what had just been said. Noah stayed beside his mother, his shoulders no longer as tight as they'd been at the start, but his eyes had grown a little older, as if he'd just learned that memory, too, can become evidence. 2 days after the supervised meeting, an article appeared on a local outlet known for mining the private lives of business figures, with a vague headline about a scandal-marked CEO keeping a single mother and 2 children inside his private estate. No one was named outright, but the details about the logistics industry, the villa enclave on the north side of the city, and an ongoing paternity dispute were enough for anyone paying attention to connect the dots. The piece raised questions about the children's safety in an environment tied to sensitive deals, leaning hard on old rumors about commercial investigations that had once brushed against Harrow Logistics. The message was dropped at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right place, not explicit enough to trigger an immediate lawsuit, but sharp enough to plant a seed of doubt in the public mind. When Evan handed the printout to Grayson, he read it through once and set it on the desk, his gaze steady, not flickering. Downstairs, Lila had seen the article on the nurse's phone, and the color drained from her face faster than any coughing spell had ever managed. She went straight into Grayson's study without knocking. "They're talking about you and about us," she said, her voice pulled tight as a wire. "If this goes any further, they could take my children because they'll think they aren't safe. Are you going to stop to protect your company?" The question wasn't only suspicion. It was the raw fear of a mother who'd lost her footing once before because of a few lines on paper. Grayson looked at her for a few seconds before he answered. Instead of calling his private attorney to threaten the newsroom or using familiar channels to smother the rumor, he picked up the phone and instructed the legal department to prepare the entire temporary guardianship file, the home inspection confirmation, the care schedule, the nurse and primary school teacher contracts. At the same time, he contacted an independent auditing firm to review his guardianship process and to make the results public if it became necessary. Lila stared at him as if she couldn't believe it. "You're going to let them see everything. If they want light, I'll give them light," Grayson said evenly. "There's nothing to hide." A follow-up piece later that day quoted an anonymous attorney claiming a child's living environment should be scrutinized closely when a temporary guardian is connected to sensitive industries. The lawyer's name wasn't printed, but the description matched Carter's legal representative. The pieces began to show their edges. Lila stood in the middle of the room, her hands faintly shaking. "I told you I don't want to owe you anything," she said more quietly. "If you step back now, I won't blame you. I'll handle it myself." In that moment, she truly believed he'd choose to protect his reputation and his empire rather than be dragged into a filthy media fight. Grayson stepped closer, keeping enough distance that she didn't have to retreat. He didn't talk about kindness or obligation. He said only one short, final sentence. "I don't leave children on the side of the road." No raised voice, no performance, but enough to sever any possibility that he'd turn away. Outside, the comments and speculation kept spreading. But inside Harrow House, the new rule had already taken hold. No counterattack through shadows, only controlled transparency. And for Lila, it was no less frightening than any threat, because it proved the man wasn't only protecting his name, he was staking the credibility of an entire empire on a promise he'd spoken to 2 children on a night of snow. The hearing took place in a large conference room at the Cook County Child Welfare Center, where fluorescent lights made every expression sharper than it would have been anywhere else. There was no jury, no gavel, only a long table, neatly stacked files, and people trying to stay calm in a war with no gunfire. Carter sat on one side with his attorney, his suit as perfect as it had been at the last meeting, his eyes confident, but no longer overly gentle. Lila sat across from him, both hands woven together on the tabletop, Noah and Eli beside her under the supervision of a child psychologist. Grayson kept his place behind them, speaking only if asked, his gaze never leaving the table. Marianne Holt opened by summarizing the temporary placement file, noting that the home inspection had been completed and the current care conditions were in place. Carter's attorney pushed back immediately, arguing that the children's living environment had to be evaluated long-term, that his client had stable income and lawful housing, while emphasizing Lila's instability over the past year. Lila closed her eyes for a brief moment as she listened to her own timelines being turned into evidence against her. No one mentioned the nights she'd stayed awake fighting for breath or the medical bills that had stacked up. There were only cold lines on paper. Then it was Marianne's turn to present notes from the supervised visits. She stated plainly that during the first contact, Noah had mentioned Carter's absence during the emergency when his mother had been hospitalized, and that this matched records of an unanswered call that night. She didn't accuse. She offered data and professional observation of the child's anxiety response when his father was mentioned. Carter shifted slightly, and his lawyer claimed at once that it was a misunderstanding and that every parent has moments when they can't be present. The air in the room grew heavier. The psychologist asked Noah whether he wanted to say anything before the discussion portion ended. The boy looked at his mother, then at Grayson, then lifted his chin. "I only trust people who keep their word," he said slowly, clearly. In a room built for adults, a child's sentence rang like metal striking stone. "I don't remember everything," Noah continued, "but I remember who was there when Mom was scared, and who wasn't." Eli squeezed his brother's hand tighter but didn't speak. Lila turned her face away to hide a tear. Grayson remained silent, his eyes not softening, but something deeper than calculation moved beneath them. The discussion continued a while longer with legal arguments and custody clauses. In the end, the panel representative delivered a temporary determination. Carter's legal paternity was recognized on paper, but due to the current stability factors and the children's psychological response, the present environment would remain in place while evaluation continued. Carter would be allowed supervised visitation on a limited schedule, with no private contact, and any changes would require child welfare approval. It wasn't a full victory for either side. Lila didn't lose her children, but she wasn't freed from the shadow of that name either. Grayson couldn't bend the decision, only accept that the law had its own rhythm. Carter stood as the session ended, fastened his jacket, and scanned the room as if memorizing where everyone sat. He paused in front of Lila, then glanced at Grayson. "I'll be back," he said evenly, as if it were simply an inevitable procedure rather than a warning. The words weren't loud, but they left a cold line running up the spines of the people who remained. When Carter left with his attorney, Noah stayed seated, his eyes fixed on the door that had just closed. This time, he didn't stand in front of his brother the way he used to. He only held Eli's hand tight, as if he'd understood the fight wouldn't end in a single afternoon, and that the one who keeps their word isn't the one who talks the most, but the one who stays the longest. The night after the hearing, Harrow House was quiet as always, but the quiet no longer felt gentle. The temporary decision was meant to be a step toward stability, yet the word temporary hung in the air like a shadow no one could touch. Noah lay in bed without closing his eyes, the star-shaped nightlight scattering familiar points of light across the ceiling, but this time they weren't enough to push the thoughts away. Eli shifted and whispered in the dark, "Do we have to move, brother?" The question was so small it nearly dissolved into the air, but Noah heard it clearly. He turned toward his brother, trying to keep his voice steady like a promise. "I don't know yet, but we're still here." Eli clutched the blanket, his hand reaching for the toy car beside his pillow on instinct. Downstairs, Lila sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Caldwell and the nurse, her voice low but weighted. She talked about the hearing, about Carter being allowed to see the boys on a schedule, about how none of it was over. Grayson stood outside the kitchen doorway, his hand resting lightly on the frame, but he didn't step in. He heard every word without interrupting, as if he understood there were conversations that didn't need his presence. When Lila repeated the phrase temporary placement the way the lawyer had said it, her voice dipped slightly. She insisted it was only a legal term, that it didn't mean someone would come tomorrow to take the boys away. But the word still rang sharp. Noah had left his bed because he couldn't sleep, his small feet making no sound on the stairs. He stopped at the landing, heard that phrase from the adults, and in his mind it stopped being a term. It became a schedule, a day already set. He pictured a morning knock, someone at the door saying it was time. His heart beat harder as he went back to the room, not waking Eli, but not daring to sleep either. Outside the kitchen, Grayson heard the soft steps, then the upstairs door closing. He knew Noah had heard something. He knew a child's fear doesn't need proof. It only needs a word the child doesn't fully understand. But he didn't go up the stairs. Not because he didn't care, but because he understood his presence could tangle the boundary even more. He was afraid that if he stepped in, his promise would become the center of a fight he couldn't control. He stayed still, listening to the faint scrape of a chair in the kitchen and Lila's sigh. In his mind, the word temporary repeated like a counting beat. He'd told himself everything was temporary, that his role was only a bridge until Lila was strong enough to stand on her own. But now, Imagining those two children being taken by an administrative decision, he realized he wasn't outside of it anymore. Upstairs, Noah lay awake in the dark, trying to catch any sound that might signal change. Eli shifted and repeated the question in his sleep. "Do we have to move?" No one answered. The house remained solid as a fortress, but inside each person, small cracks were quietly spreading. And in the middle of it all, the word temporary had turned from a legal decision into a countdown no one knew the end point of. The next morning, Harrow House woke the way it always did, but Noah could no longer hold on to his usual calm. He sat still through breakfast, not touching the pancakes, even though Mrs. Caldwell had set out an extra portion for him the way she always did. Eli looked at his brother, then at Grayson, sensing something on the verge of breaking without understanding what it was. Lila tried to keep her voice gentle when she asked Noah if he wanted to go to the activity room with the primary school teacher, but the boy shook his head. When Grayson stood to leave the kitchen, Noah snapped like a string pulled too tight. "You're going to disappear too," he said louder than usual, his voice trembling and cracking in the middle of the room. Everything froze. "You're going to leave like him. Every grown-up says they'll stay, and then they leave anyway." It wasn't a cautious question anymore. It was an explosion built from sleepless nights and words he hadn't fully understood. Eli startled, and the toy car slipped from his hands and hit the floor. A small sound that rang out in the heavy air. Lila rose on instinct, but Grayson moved first, before she could reach her son. He didn't stay standing tall the way he usually did. He dropped to his knees at Noah's eye level, resting one hand on his own knee instead of touching the boy. He didn't try to cut Noah off or order him quiet. He waited until Noah had said everything, until the boy's voice turned into the choked sobs of a true 7-year-old. "I won't promise what I can't do," Grayson said slowly, each word clear as if he were signing a commitment that couldn't be revised. "But this, I can do. I can stay." Noah looked at him through tears, his small shoulders shaking. Not the hard stance of a little guard, but the pure fear of a child who didn't want to lose anyone else. Eli stepped closer, clung to his brother's arm, and asked in a voice that was small but hurtful in its quiet, "Are we going to be separated?" The question wasn't a legal hypothetical anymore. It was the core fear of two children who'd once stood huddled outside an iron gate. Grayson didn't hesitate. "No," he said, one word, heavy as an oath. No raised voice, no added explanation, only certainty that didn't move. Noah drew in a deep breath, as if testing whether the answer could hold. Leela stood beside them, her hands clenched together, tears slipping down in silence. She saw something she hadn't wanted to believe before. This man wasn't using power to hide emotion. He was placing himself inside a promise he knew could drag consequences across his entire world. Grayson didn't stand up right away. He stayed there, level with Noah, until the boy's sobs eased and Eli stopped trembling. In that moment, the vast house stopped feeling like a cold museum. It became the place where a man who'd always lived by control accepted that some things can't be measured by contracts or strategy. Lila stepped closer, placed a hand on Noah's shoulder, then looked at Grayson. Her eyes weren't only defensive or suspicious anymore. There was recognition in them, the understanding that he wasn't trying to save them as a favor. He was taking on responsibility without asking for anything in return. And for the first time since the night of snow, the warmth in this house didn't come from the fireplace or the lights. It came from a promise spoken when no one was able to keep pretending they were strong. Only a few days after Noah broke down, and that promise was spoken in the warm kitchen, another blow landed, not with noise, but with official paperwork. The Child Welfare Office received an anonymous complaint about the living environment at Harrow House, alleging that excessive security, dense camera systems, and sensitive business connections made the home unfit for children. Attached were several photos, cut and stitched from angles outside the gate, designed to make it look as if unfamiliar people were constantly coming and going with something secretive about them. An article on a small site kept pushing the story in the direction of a logistics empire using power to keep children as a moral cover. Marianne notified them there would be an additional review because of the complaint's serious nature. Lila read the notice and felt her hands go cold, and Noah stood close beside her. This time he didn't say anything, but his eyes already understood that another wave was coming. Grayson didn't show anger. He only called Evan into the study and requested the full camera logs, access data, and delivery schedules for the days the photos were supposedly taken. Evan worked through the night, combing through every timestamp, every access code. The next morning, He said a detailed summary in front of Grayson showing the images had been stitched together from multiple different times. One frame had even been edited to match the hour the boys were at school. More importantly, certain access entries at the gate had been made by a subcontractor who had once worked for Harrow Logistics and was now cooperating with the company of the attorney behind Carter. The name matched the one that had been mentioned in the earlier veiled phone call. The reveal wasn't vague anymore. This wasn't only an attempt to secure paternity rights. It was a calculated smear strategy. The target didn't stop with the children. If Harrow House could be declared unsafe, if Grayson could be dragged into an ethical and legal scandal, the southern warehouse routes he controlled would fall into an opponent's hands. Carter wasn't the only one who would benefit. He was only the front of a larger plan. Grayson didn't reach for the familiar methods of the underworld. He chose the cleanest way to meet it head-on. All evidence of photo manipulation, access logs, and the link between the subcontractor and Carter's attorney was sent directly to the Child Welfare Office and the county's legal counsel. At the same time, Harrow Logistics announced termination of the contract with the implicated subcontractor, along with a lawsuit for data intrusion and information manipulation. No public threats, only lawful steps taken through the proper channels. During the additional review, Marianne examined the new documents and required Carter's side to explain the connection between the subcontractor and his lawyer. Carter could no longer hold the absolute confidence he'd worn before. He denied knowing the details, but he couldn't explain why the complaint photos had originated from his own network. The panel decided to tighten Carter's access further, requiring every visit to include enhanced supervision and issuing a warning about non-transparent influence. The advantage he'd tried to manufacture flipped instantly into a weakness. When the meeting ended, Carter walked out with a face that was no longer calm, while his attorney muttered something under his breath, sharp with frustration. Grayson didn't watch them for long. He knew this fight had already moved beyond the personal, but in the house on the north side of the city, Noah and Eli were still sitting under warm yellow light, fitting puzzle pieces together, unaware that, for the first time, the adult world had tried to use them as leverage and failed. And in the quiet after the wave passed, it was clear the advantage had shifted. Carter had lost his momentum, and the promise spoken in that kitchen was now protected not only by feeling, but by law and by truth. After the accusations were peeled apart and Carter's leverage began to fade, Harrow House returned to a familiar quiet, but it no longer felt like it used to. Grayson understood that fighting clean only solved one specific attack, while the system's cracks were still there, waiting for another family to fall through. A few weeks later, in a brief meeting in his study, he informed Evan and the legal team that he was establishing an independent fund called the Wintergate Initiative. The aim wasn't an image campaign or a glossy speech. The aim was to provide emergency housing support during winter, temporary coverage for cases where health insurance had been interrupted, and legal support for families at risk of losing their children due to administrative procedure. The fund would be registered entirely separate from Harrow Logistics, with an independent board of directors and publicly reported annual audits. There would be no corporate logo on the sign, no loud launch event, only a short statement sent to social service organizations and the county child welfare office. When Marianne Holt read the proposal, she asked to meet Grayson in person. The meeting took place in her office, not at Harrow House. She turned each page, reviewed the financial structure, the operating charter, and the clauses ensuring there would be no interference with legal procedures. "This isn't how you buy support, is it?" she asked bluntly. Grayson answered calmly that he wasn't buying trust. He was closing a gap that had nearly pulled Lila and the boys under. Marianne studied him a moment longer, then said quietly, "This is how the snowy night doesn't repeat itself." It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement that real change has to live in structure, not in a temporary surge of emotion. Leela heard about Wintergate from Grayson himself, not through the press. She was silent for a moment before she asked, "What do you want me to do in it?" "I want you to do what you understand best," he replied. "You used to work in a clinic. You understand families pushed to the margins. The fund needs a coordinator with real experience, not a public face." Lila held his gaze a beat longer, weighing gratitude against pride. "I'll join," she said, "but I'm not doing it because I owe you. I'm doing it because I know what it feels like to be left behind." Grayson nodded. "That's the only right reason." In the weeks that followed, Wintergate began accepting its first cases, helping a family at risk of eviction during winter, and a young mother who couldn't afford to reactivate her insurance. No cameras turned toward Harrow House, no exclusive interviews. Only calls answered, and expenses recorded with transparent documentation. Noah and Eli didn't understand the full scale of what was happening, but they could feel that this house was no longer only their temporary refuge. It had become the starting point for something wider. When Noah saw Lila at the dining table, reviewing another family's file and making careful notes, he understood that his mother wasn't standing at the edge of the system anymore. She was on the other side, helping patch the cracks. Grayson watched from a distance, not stepping into how Lila worked, not placing conditions. He knew a real home isn't only walls and a roof. It's the principles that keep it standing. And for the first time since the night of snow, the idea of home in his mind was no longer a fortress against the world. It was a structure protected by law, by transparency, and by a promise kept whole. Winter was gradually receding, and snow no longer covered the walkway in front of Harrow House, but the kitchen light each evening still held the same warmth it had on the first night. The two boys stepped through the iron gate. There was no loud engagement announcement, no press release, no staged family photos. Lila kept her own last name. She still signed Wintergate Initiative files as an independent coordinator. Grayson was still Grayson, a man used to standing amid contracts and heavy decisions. Only one thing had changed in a way you could feel. He didn't walk into the kitchen like the unquestioned owner of the space anymore. That evening, as the smell of hot soup drifted out and the familiar sound of spoons tapping bowls rose and fell, Grayson paused at the kitchen doorway. He didn't step in right away. He stood there, his hand resting lightly on the frame, and he waited. Noah looked up first. His eyes no longer guarded the way they'd been in the beginning. Eli was trying to blow on his soup to cool it, but he still glanced toward the doorway. Leela saw Grayson's silhouette, but she didn't call to him. She let the boys decide. And then Noah smiled, looked at his little brother, and together they called out, "Come eat." The door opened from the inside, not because Grayson had the right, but because he was invited. Grayson walked in and pulled out a chair as if he belonged at the table in the simplest way, not as the man controlling the game. No one talked about the hearing, the scandal, or the complaints that had come and gone. The table talk stayed with school lessons, with the first family Wintergate had just helped move into a new apartment, with the fact that Eli had slept through the night for a full week. That piece wasn't a fairy tale. It was built from law, from transparency, and from choices that weren't easy. In the study behind them, a new file lay on Grayson's desk. A federal investigative agency had begun reviewing certain transport routes in the city, and Harrow Logistics appeared on the list for scrutiny. It wasn't an accusation, only a sign that the outside fight had never truly ended. But this time, when Grayson looked at that file, he didn't think only about risk or strategy. He thought about the lit kitchen table, about two children who'd learned to believe that grown-ups can keep their word, and about a woman who'd chosen to stay not out of dependence, but out of responsibility. He understood that if another battle came, he'd step into it the same clean way he already had, because now he had something worth protecting that didn't require hiding. This story isn't about a mafia boss changing the world in a single night. It's about how a door only truly matters when it's opened from the inside. It's about how kindness isn't a burst of emotion. It's a decision you make again and again, every day. And sometimes, the strongest thing a person can do isn't controlling everything. It's staying when someone else is the most afraid. If you've followed the story this far, tell us what you felt. Have you ever lived with that temporary feeling in your own life? And what helped you stay standing? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video to spread stories that reach the heart. Your support helps us keep telling more meaningful journeys each day. Leave a comment. We truly want to hear your deepest thoughts and feelings. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.